everyone for showing up to this event today. My name is Gail Weisswasser. I'm one of the two co-owners, along with Amy Joyce, who is right over here, of Wonderland Books. So thank you for coming out on a somewhat chilly Saturday afternoon. We're very pleased to see this great crowd.
Do you want one of these?
Sure. Can you guys hear me now? Okay. In honor of Women's History Month and International Women's Day, we are thrilled today to be hosting Melissa Ludtke, who is the author of Locker Room Talk. In 1977, Ludtke, who at the time covered MLB, was not allowed into the Yankees locker room after the World Series win because she was a woman. In 1978, she won a lawsuit for the right for women to have equal access to MLB locker rooms, paving the way for women's sports journalists. Today she's going to talk about her book, and she will be in conversation with Ava Wallace, who is a sports journalist for The Post. Ava writes the sports department's weekly newsletter, The Sports Moment, and covers tennis and women's sports. She joined The Post in 2015 to cover college athletics before moving to the WNBA and the Washington Wizards beat.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Gail. Thank you guys for being here. I'm so delighted to talk to Melissa, who I was just saying I met for the first time at fall at a panel at the University of Maryland, where we were also talking about women's sports journalism. And the very cool thing about whenever I get to talk to Melissa is I get to thank her, because without Melissa, I would not be able to do my job today. I was actually thinking this morning, I was trying to think of the first locker room I ever went into, and I don't think I could remember. That's
probably good.
Not big of a deal it is to me.
Yeah, that's good.
I think I actually settled on, it was the Arizona Cardinals.
Okay.
During one of their many bad years, and they were very mean, and that's why I don't cover baseball. so I learned a lot from your book
losing
about
locker rooms
baseball.
are always the worst. Losing are the worst.
Yeah.
So. But they can also be the one where the best story lies. So
There
you know, kind of have to be there if you need to be there. So
and, so we're here to talk about a really big time with the Yankees, a really big time in baseball. I am, of course, talking about the fact that Yankees players can finally grow facial hair.
Absolutely. I mean, my God. You know, George Steinbrenner might be rolling in his grave. He was the owner when I was covering them, and of course his son is the owner now, and they finally have allowed facial hair on the Yankees. You know, Johnny Damon left the Red Sox to go to the Yankees, and when he left the Red Sox, he had hair down past his shoulders, you know, and he was looking like, you know, sort of the Tasmanian devil. And when he got to the Yankees, they cleaned him up pretty fast. You know, he had to make a trade, and you know, in his appearance, and he did. But yeah, so I mean, we're moving into a new generation, new
Finally,
century.
I kind of said that just to make the point that baseball, I think of all of our major American sports, is one of the most culturally entrenched, one of the slowest moving, at least in my opinion.
Well, it was a conservative organization and league and sport, and certainly a conservative commissioner that I had to end up doing battle with. But one of the reasons is because baseball always considered itself apart from all of the other sports. You know, in 1975, so 2 years before I had my run-in with Commissioner Kuhn, the NHL and the NBA, and I might say for those of Washington, since we're in Washington, we can say this, and looking around the crowd, I think most of you will remember Watergate. Watergate? Yes, okay. It is a hotel, but it was also a scandal. And Larry O'Brien, it was his office that was raided. And that began the sort of Watergate and led to the downfall of President Nixon. Larry O'Brien was the commissioner of the NBA when the decision had to be made about whether he would provide equal access to women reporters in 1975. And I think you can understand, Larry O'Brien said, of course, there are women covering this sport and they ought to have equal access. It was obvious to him. And it was obvious to the commissioner of the NHL. It was in part obvious to these two men for a self-interested reason. And that is that those two leagues at the time were begging for coverage by anyone. You know, I mean, if a cow had come along and said, you know, I can be trained to write a story, they would have said, give him access. But, you know, in fact, when women were just coming into the business at that point, every major newspaper needed just one. We only need one woman because we're going to get sued if we don't have any. One will give us cover, and that's all we need. And when they arrived, these women, it would have been blasphemy if the editor had thought of putting them on baseball, because baseball was our national pastime. It was what you aspired to if you were a sports writer. You spent your life covering high school sports, then college sports, then this and that, just to be assigned to be baseball. So there were no women covering baseball, and these women who came into the papers as the token woman at the time, they weren't going to be assigned, so they were assigned to hockey. They were assigned to basketball, which I know people now, the young people who know basketball now would say, well, wait a minute, that's a big sport. It wasn't in the 70s. It wasn't. And so that's the sport that the women got. And so those two commissioners, it was an easy call for them. If we've got a woman covering the NHL at the New York Times, and we've got a women covering basketball for UPI and Newsday and the rest, they have to have equal access to do the stories, because we depend on those stories to get fans to come in and to get the story out. That's when newspapers really mattered. So anyway, that's a long answer to you just mentioning that one thing, but it does bring in a little bit of Washington history that does seem relevant at this moment. I'll leave you all to determine whether you feel the same way. Okay. So.
And I will say, so I started working for the Post in 2015 covering colleges, and baseball is
Put that closer.
Baseball still kind of has that reputation in a lot of old-fashioned newspapers. That's kind of where our best writers go. If you're a writerly writer, you get to cover baseball, and it used to be you get to cover boxing. Those were the two places that you got to tell like great American stories. So I said, please put me on women's basketball. That's where I would like to go. But you were a baseball writer for 2 years. You spoke really wonderfully in your book about the love that your mother passed down for the sport.
Yes.
Baseball writer for 2 years before court case even happened, and you were actually welcomed into the clubhouse before you were shut out of it. So I love how you paint the rhythms of being a sports beat writer, where basically you go to the office all day, you go to the clubhouse in the middle of the day and spend hours and hours, cover a game, go to the bar at night with your fellow sports writers, and do it all again the next day, pretty much until you fall down or until the end of the season.
Well, except there are a couple things I have to sort of amend in that kind of sunshiny portrayal. And that is that, you know, until I'd been 2 years on what you're calling the beat, and I was a reporter researcher, not a writer officially, my title, just to be accurate, I had no access to the clubhouse whatsoever. None, zero, not even to the Yankees. But it was with the Yankees that I spent most of my time. They were really the story of that time. I mean, you just had a soap opera in the clubhouse. You had a very amazing team on the field that was clearly moving its way to the World Series. You know, in 1977 and 78, they made it to the World Series. They hadn't won a championship or World Series for 14 years. The city said, come on, George Steinbrenner, pay the money, get those players, and let's win it. So that's where I spent my time. So let me just give you just briefly, it took me 2 years of being around there, and it took midway through the season in 1977 for a wonderful young rookie seasoned PR person for the Yankees who was my age. That made all the difference. He wasn't a curmudgeonly older PR person sort of holding the traditions, you know, and saying, no, nothing can change. He knew change was in the air. And so he actually listened to me. He listened to the frustrations I had at not being able to get to the players. He was the one who came up with an idea. And he came to me after the All-Star break and he said, you know what? He said, let me just go in the front door of the clubhouse. You wait around at the side door. I'll go in, I'll let you in the side door, take you in the passageway to Billy Martin's office. You can hang out there. So it's not the locker room, but it is getting me closer. And it's moving, it's a gradualist notion. Not banging on the doors, not demanding that I have to be there. It's building step by step, that sort of trust with the people. I'm the only one, I'm the only woman. It's not like I'm going to demand and my demands are going to be met. There's no cavalry coming up behind me to back me up. I have no army to call in. So I said, great. So that's where I spent the second half of the 1977 season. It was not until the last 2 games of that season that this same man, Mickey Morabito, leaves me 2 daily clubhouse passes when I arrive at the stadium. And I went on the field, I said, Mickey, did you mean to leave these for me?
Why'd you ask?
I mean, my goodness. And he said, absolutely. He said, in my view, you've earned them, and I know you'll use them in the best way possible. And I think what he was saying to me is, I know you're a gradualist, and I know you're going to respect that for you to do your job most effectively, you're going to have to, again, build this trust. We're at the next step. And he's right. He said, I used those 2 passes those days not to go in after the games. I wasn't a daily newspaper writer. I didn't have to be there to write a game story. I used them in the other time that no one knows about, that I was kept out. So we need a little bit of a primer here on when people have clothes on and when they have them off. So let's start there. I was not allowed into the locker room in the 50 minutes between batting practice and the start of the game. That is when magazine writers and newspaper writers did their work. It wasn't after the game in the chaos. They were just looking for a quote or 2 to fill into their game story. They were getting features. They were figuring out what was happening. They had time with players to really talk in those 50 minutes. Okay. Not one player changed out of his uniform from batting practice to when he went back out on the field. I was not allowed in. So this is a mathematical equation we're doing now, okay? They were dressed. I was kept out. So ipso facto, it was never about nudity. I think a lot of people came today with this notion because it was the one put forward in all of the press coverage by the male sports writers and, kind of sent down to them from Commissioner Kuhn and his media operation, that his job was to protect the sexual privacy of his players. Now, I never understood what that meant or how I was disturbing it. But let's leave that on the table. If indeed that was the case, why wasn't I in before the game? So actually, this was never about nudity, right? It was about exclusion. And before me, and I didn't know this history then, we didn't have Google, I don't know this stuff. But before that, I found out later, women weren't allowed on the field during batting practice. They weren't allowed to sit in the press box. They were not allowed to eat their pregame meal with the men's sports writers. And they were thrown out of the annual baseball gala in January. Now, in January, the men were wearing their tuxedos. No man I know sat in a press box without clothes on. He usually had a fedora and a typewriter and the whole thing. They were in their uniforms on the field. So all of the pattern of exclusion of women was to make their jobs so difficult that they would go away. That was the whole notion. They were invading this boys' club, and the sooner they left, the better. So by the time I get there in 77, when this happens, the only remaining sort of bulwark against the women, a way to keep them out, the invaders at bay, was to keep them out of the clubhouse. So why don't we go from there? You can take us somewhere you want to go.
Actually, I wanted to back up, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Can you tell me kind of the state of women in sports journalism at that time, and especially at Sports Illustrated? I think I knew this in some back part of my mind, but now when I go out on the beat, I report my story and I write my story.
Yeah.
I didn't realize reporters was one thing back then, and you sent your work up to a writer who would shape it for the magazine and do everything. But can you tell me, were you so alien at that time, walking into not just a baseball clubhouse when you were able to, but even being in the press corps?
Of course.
What were you seeing at that time?
Yeah, no. I was the only woman at most baseball parks and in most baseball press boxes. And, there were moments where I was excluded up to 1976, prior to that season. I was with Roger Kahn working on a story as his reporter, and we were out in Chicago. and I wasn't necessarily thrown out of the press box, but Roger was warned by several writers at that time who came and whispered in his ear, "Hey, Roger." They all knew him. They knew he was sort of, old at that time. He'd been covering the game back in the 50s. They wanted to remind him, "Roger, you can't bring your girlfriend into the press box." So they whispered that. And then later that night, we were supposed to meet up with Bill Veeck, who was the owner of the team, in what was known as the Bard's Room. And that was a beautiful mahogany room with, fireplace. They had their personal bartender. It was for the sports writers after the game. So I walked in with Roger. We were supposed to wait for Bill Veeck to come, and the guys were going to drink into the night. I was going to have a little seltzer and take notes. That was the idea. And the bartender said to Roger, Roger, your secretary can't be in here. You can't stay in here if she is here. And so Roger got mad at him and said, if she has to leave, I'm leaving, and tell Bill Veeck we'll see him tomorrow. And so, these things I didn't know. He didn't share these with me then. He wrote this in a book called October's Men. That's only when I learned about this. So this was all happening up until my time. But, you're right that women who got the jobs at the newspapers I'm talking about for hockey and the rest, they were writing stories. They weren't a reporter issuing it. Time Incorporated and other magazines had a very different way of doing their work. And at the lower end of the ladder were these reporter researchers. It was a very fancy name for what were actually fact checkers. And the fact checkers were there to be sure that the men's stories didn't contain any errors. And if you hold this for a minute and just say something, I'm going to find this passage because it's just too good not to read. It's just too good. It's too good. But anyway, yes. Let's see. So I'm going to look up under, what am I going to look up under? Who founded them? Haddon and what's the other guy that founded Time Inc.? Anyway, it's a thing about fact checking, and I'll just summarize it because I'm not going to waste time here looking it up. Essentially, a editor at Time magazine, soon after Henry Luce and Haddon founded the magazine, wrote a memo in which they defined this job. And they said, it's a job that's going to make any girl very happy. She's going to be very happy in this because she's going to have the job of being sure that everything that the writers and editors put in stories is correct. But also, if it turns out that anything gets past her and any one reader writes and says, by the way, you've made an error, that she also gets to take the blame for it. So it's a perfect job for any woman. That was essentially the way this was set up. So in the history of Time Incorporated, when I arrived, to answer your question, the reporter researchers were pretty much women. So you had on the lower edge of the ladder, the women, and then you went up, and it all became very male. Now, there's one thing that intervened, and that is that women noticed that there was a bit of discrimination going on here. And just like the women at Newsweek, who Lynn Povich has written a fabulous book called, Good Girls Revolt. Fabulous. 1970, they take Kay Graham to court because she owns the Newsweek. 46 of them sue for discrimination, gender discrimination, based on hiring, pay, and promotion, saying there's a little inequality here. Well, there was. And Eleanor Holmes Norton was their attorney. It's so interesting going back in history, the characters you find. And after the thing happened at Newsweek, the women at Time said, hey, I think this might be going on here too. So in 1971, they sued. 136 women sued. Very few from Sports Illustrated, because the managing editor, Andrew Laguerre, told the women, essentially, word got out, if you sign this petition to take Time Inc. to court, I will not promote you while I'm here. So a lot of women stayed back from signing it at SI, but fortunately there were some heroes at Time and Fortune and some of the others. The reason I give you that history is it has to do with my lawsuit, but it also has to do with the fact that there was a sprinkling of men in the researcher reporter category, because it was easier to hire men in the lower categories to work out the gender discrimination problem than it was to bring women up to the top categories. So there were a number of men, but you know what you noticed is they very quickly ascended out of the reporter researcher and they became the writers and moved up. And the women in the researcher reporter category at Sports Illustrated became a very valuable commodity on the free market, because all those newspapers that needed just that one woman hired the researcher reporters at SI who were never going to be promoted, and they made them writers. The woman whose job I took was made the editor of World Tennis Magazine from being a reporter researcher at SI. So that will give you some sense of what that place was like to work at. So yeah, it was.
It was a good history. Well,
Oh, and then let me share this little gem from Roger's book with you, because it's fabulous. Roger Kahn writes about how he was so excited that he was given this reporter, me, to take for 2 weeks to do reporting with him when he was assigned to do this story on the old timers and stuff. And I was thrilled by the assignment. He writes in his book, I never heard him say this to me, he said he went to the editor to thank him for assigning, me as a reporter. He was thrilled by this. And the reporter laughed at him sort of and chuckled in the good old boy way and said, Roger, you can take her for 2 weeks, do anything you want with her, but just get her back here after the assignment. Really? Really? Well, I want to report that Roger was an absolute gentleman. It was the thrill of my life to go out on the road and report with him. But anyway, you learn amazing things when you actually read books many years later about your experience. So, go ahead.
well, I was going to ask you, so you mentioned this, you work hard for 2 years,
Yes,
building
I
relationships,
do.
building trust, getting into the Yankees clubhouse. You're let in for those 2 games.
Yes.
Why does MLB close the doors after?
Well, they
one of
don't, because
their
I go in the
PR
American
people?
League Championship Series. I'm also in there. I think the remarkable thing and the memorable thing about this ought to be that no story was written about me being in there. Evidently, no one really cared. The players didn't really care. There were some idiots, who had to show off, who had to do this and that. Players would pull towels off of players next to them, ha ha ha, etc. There was all of that kind of thing. But I had always understood I'm in their place. I've entered their clubhouse. I had to understand there was a red line somewhere. I didn't know how to define it. Now remember, there is no such term as sexual harassment in the 70s. Please remember this. Didn't come in until Anita Hill. We don't know that word. We don't even know that behavior. We don't know how to define it. We also don't even know the word misogyny. Who knows misogyny? It's just what happened to us every day, okay? Really. So you have to place yourself kind of back in this time. So unless something egregious happened, and I didn't know what that egregious thing would be, but I hoped that I would recognize it when it happened, and it never happened to me. Someone's wife or girlfriend must have at some point been convinced to make a cake, because the Yankees at that one time during that period that I was in before the World Series, a cake appeared on a table in the locker room, said for women writers only, and it was in the shape of a penis. Okay, I walked by it once, but I'm not gonna walk by it again. I'm not, it's just, you had to just deal with it. It just had to deal with it, and that was just part of the territory. But the thing was that I was able to do my job for the first time, fully do my job. And if you have the ambition, which I did, to think that I know this sport, I can do this, I can write a story, I can report a story. I want to have the opportunity to show people that I can do it. Without access to that locker room, I don't have it. So now we're getting to the World Series.
And I was so surprised to learn that they'd actually taken a vote of players.
Well, only because I asked.
But I guess what I was surprised to learn is that most of them were fine with it. They
Well,
said,
I'd love
"We
to.
don't care."
Yeah, I would love to get across to everyone here that the players were so much more advanced in their understanding of this than the sports writers were, the male sports writers. They were so threatened by me, which was bizarre. I was only one person. Yeah, it was only one person. But I think they just saw me as epitomizing, you know, this herd of women that were coming. You know, there's this scene that Roger Angell writes about Diane Shaw at Fenway Park in 1972 when she arrives there, and at first the curmudgeonly Bill Crowley, you know, Irish guy in his 70s, just hates the idea that a woman has asked him for anything. He says to her, he says, you know, Diane, you can come, but I'm going to give you a seat in the grandstand. You can't go on the field. You can't go in the press box, etc. So she gets her male attorney and male editor to call. Gets all of that changed. And she thinks she's in good shape. And so she gets there. She's on the field. She's walking up to go get her meal. And they walk her up. She goes toward the dining room, and he says, no. We've got a picnic table out here for you. You can't eat in there with them. And they had a picnic table with a sign on it saying Ladies Pavilion. And she's like, what? How was I supposed to think about this? I mean, I thought about the press box, the field, all the places. I didn't imagine that this could happen. So that's 1972. So anyway, I get through the American League Championship Series. No one's written a thing. No one's tried to throw me out. The players are pretty good. There are a few jackasses among them, but so what? There always are, you know, come on. And so we get to the World Series. I go to pick up my credential, which is what you wear around your neck, which, you know, tells you what you have access to,
How
right?
you get anywhere.
Right. And it says I have access to the clubhouse. I think the baseball writers sort of forgot they were writing a female name at the top. But anyway, I had it. And so I knew the Yankees was fine, you know? I'd worked hard. This was good. But I also knew that the Dodgers had never had a woman covering them. Why would they? No team did. And so I thought, because I was a gradualist, because I wanted to do it right, because I didn't want to barge in and then be thrown out and have a scene. I just didn't feel that was the right way to do it. So I went to Tommy Lasorda, who I'd met with Roger Kahn. Mm-hmm. He knew me, you know, greeted me, you know, Melissa. And when I mentioned the idea of just going into his office, the manager's office, like I had done with Billy first, I was okay if that was all I got that night. He looked white as a ghost and ran away from me. And he's pulled on Tommy John. You all know Tommy John, right? The left elbow, you know, the Tommy John surgery. Yeah. Tommy John was the player rep of the Dodgers. So Tommy was such a wonderful man, is a wonderful man. He's still alive. He's in Florida. I talk to him still to this day. Tommy looked at me. We walked down the dugout tunnel. We sat in the dugout. He talked to me for 15 minutes. I told him about the Yankees. I showed him the pass. And I said that, you know, I didn't know, but I might need to go into the Dodgers locker room. I wanted to give a heads up. And Tommy Lasorda wasn't interested, so here I was with him. I want to tell you the most honest and best response that I've ever received to this issue from a ball player, and that was Tommy turning to me and saying, you know, I'd feel really uncomfortable with you coming into the locker room, but I think you have every right to be there. And I thought, that man, he's going to do a fight for me. So when he suggested going back and having a team meeting, and he'd let me know the next day how it turned out, I guess I could have said, well, why should you vote on something I already have? I could have, but I didn't. I said, let's just let it go through. I had a good feeling about Tommy having a good meeting. And so right before the game started, that Tuesday night, I think everything's on course, you know, pretty good. And Tommy says to me, he says, you know, it wasn't unanimous, but it's a majority. That's how we do things. As far as we're concerned, you have every right to be there. He said, now I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but you have every right to be there. I said, thank you very much, started to walk away. He said, hey, Melissa, back here for a minute. He said, can you go tell our PR person that we have made an agreement on this? Because he wasn't going to see him before the game started. Again, I don't have to do this, but I'm nice Wellesley girl, you know. I mean, you know, I'm gonna do it. I mean, if he asks me, I'm gonna do it. I didn't know Steve Brenner, never met him, but I went to find him, and I told him he looked just like Tommy Lasorda, white as a ghost, ran away, and I didn't think about it. I just thought, okay, things are okay. I've done everything, marked it all off. 5th inning. I'm sitting in the auxiliary press box because it's an overflow for the World Series. My God, it's the Dodgers and the Yankees. This is historic. This is the series that had the most viewers almost ever for a World Series. It was extraordinary. And you had these marquee towns. This was a big one. And so there were tons and tons of reporters. So I'm in the auxiliary press box, and over this little squeaky little loudspeaker, I hear my name, you know, to report to the press box.
Nightmare.
And what can only be described as one of the meanest things that baseball commissioner's office ever did to another human being was that they ordered Mickey Morabito, the only man who would ever help me, ever listen to me, ever tried to make progress without stirring the waters. They made him meet me at the back door and be the one to tell me that I would never go into a clubhouse during this World Series or ever. It was, I write this in the book, it was one of the hardest sort of couple paragraphs to write, because I just remember it so vividly, I can picture it. We were so awkward with each other. I mean, Mickey, who had been such a good listener, Mickey, who was pure blood Italian, always spoke with his hands, you know, and just smiled, his eyes twinkled. And here he was, his arms locked to his side, his hair down over his eyes. He didn't want to look at me. He didn't want to make eye contact. He had to tell me this. And when he finished, I said, I want to talk to the commissioner if this is his decision. And he says, Melissa, you can't. This is not possible. You can't do that. He said, but I can get you the media director. So I went through the media director. He told me the same thing. He said, it doesn't matter if the Yankees have given you permission or the Dodgers have given you permission, or both of them and baseball writers have given you permission. There's only one person on this earth who can give you permission, and that's Commissioner Kuhn, and he will not. Well, he was right about that, because as anyone who knows the history of baseball knows, the commissioner has absolute authority over that game. And that was because the commissioner office was set up after the Black Sox scandal in 1920, when they convinced a judge to give them his name as a guarantee that there would never be this kind of malfeasance again, this gambling, etc. And in exchange, he asked for and got from all the owners absolute authority in that commissioner's office. So he was right. It was only his call and his call alone. And so that's how it happened that Bowie Kuhn and I, who never actually met, never shook hands, never had a conversation, ended up facing off against each other in a courtroom. But he wasn't there.
I was going to say.
It was his lawyers. I was.
It was his
he
lawyers who
wasn't.
didn't seem super prepared.
No.
Can you tell me about your lawyer? I loved this part of the book where you kind of, it almost turns into a legal thriller.
How many people have shopped at FAO Schwartz? How many? How many? Let's see a show of hands. Okay. FAO Schwartz, teddy bears, everything else, right?
Melissa, your mic's not.
Mike. My mic's not working. Thank you, Linda. You're great. Bola, good. Okay, yeah, I'll try that one.
Siemens here.
Better?
Yep.
Better? Okay. All right, so now that we know how many people have shopped there, my lawyer, his name, where'd my phone go? It doesn't matter, was FAO Schwartz Jr. Frederick August Otto Schwartz Jr., great-great-grandson of the founder of FAO Schwartz. But from a legal perspective, he was also one hell of a lawyer. He was absolutely brilliant. When he took the call from Time Incorporated in late November, when they'd run out of energy arguing with the commissioner that separate would never be equal, we thought we resolved that in Brown versus Board of Education a few years earlier, that evidently in Kuhn's mind, separate could be equal. But anyway, we'd run out of juice with that, and so they were going to go to federal court. And so they called their counsel, Time Inc. counsel. At least, they set out to call him. So here's how that call had to go. This is in the old days. Remember, we still had switchboards, etc. Okay, so the Time Inc. Time Inc. operator calls the Cravath, Swaine and Moore, white shoe law firm. Asks for Fritz. Fritz is not there, so they have to then patch the call down to the White House switchboard. The White House switchboard then has to patch it over to the executive office building, because my Fritz, he liked to be called Fritz, my Fritz is visiting the other Fritz, who's Fritz Mondale, who's then the vice president. The reason he's visiting Fritz Mondale is because Mondale depended on him. My Fritz had, for the 2 years before that, been the youngest chief counsel in the history of Congress when he was in charge of the investigations for the Church Committee. People know the Church Committee on Privacy and Surveillance. My Fritz was the one who discovered the counterpol activities of the government against the Black Panthers, against the women's movement. He's the one who discovered the quote-unquote anonymous letter sent to Martin Luther King Jr. by the FBI, i.e. Hoover, that suggested to Martin Luther King Jr. that he should commit suicide within the next 23 days, which is when he was to be given the Nobel Peace Prize. This is my Fritz. This is what he'd done. So the other Fritz, they'd gotten to be great friends because both of them were Fritzes, would call him down from New York after this was over and ask him for legal assistance in terms of, developing the laws that came out of the Church Committee that have given the protections that we have today. This is my Fritz. So my Fritz was so excited because he was used to First Amendment cases. Of course, he's representing Time Incorporated. He had a 14th Amendment case. It thrilled him beyond all. You can't imagine. He was so excited. So, that was kind of, he was getting ready. That was it. He was ready to go. But then we had to file the complaint, which of course he wrote. And then what happens is they have to choose the judge. They have to choose the judge. So ask me about that.
I was going to say, you get your Fritz, and then that clerk draws a card.
Draws a card.
Which
the
is
clerk, right? Yep.
So your Fritz has an excellent case on his hand, and he has the perfect judge for the case, except for the fact that she doesn't like baseball.
Hates baseball.
I got a really good history lesson in this book on Judge Constance Baker Motley, the first Black woman to argue in front of the Supreme Court. She won 9 out of 10 cases, I think it was.
Yes, and the 10th one, the court itself overturned, so she actually won 10 of 10.
But Fritz had a lot to work with there.
Yes, he
had
did.
A lot to cater
but let's
to.
back up to
Okay,
Constance
let's back up
for
to
a moment,
Constance.
just because she is incredible.
She was
incredible.
incredible.
She's incredible. I didn't know any of this. There was no Google. Fritz told me a little. She worked in civil rights. That's about what I knew. She didn't tell me that she'd gotten James Meredith into the University of Mississippi when Thurgood Marshall had thrown a letter from James Meredith on Connie's desk in laughter and said, "Here, Connie, you take this. This is never going to happen." And I didn't know at the time that the reason that Connie was sent to the South to basically dismantle the Jim Crow system with these cases revolving around higher education, I didn't know that Thurgood sent her because he was frightened, and rightly so, that if he sent himself or any of the other men, and she was the only woman at the NAACP Legal and Defense Fund, that they might be assassinated. He was not wrong. She could not stay in any of the hotels in Jackson, Mississippi. Let's stay there for a moment. So where did she stay often? She stayed at Medgar Evers' house. I think we all know that Medgar Evers was assassinated in his own front yard. The house that she stayed in with bodyguards with guns on top of the roof when she had to stay there. In the courthouses where she argued these cases before Southern judges who would turn their back to her when she spoke. She could not use the restroom. She could not use the telephone to communicate with people in New York. So that meant she had to go out on the street and walk several blocks to be able to go to the place where she could use the restroom or use the telephone. And every time she did, she was heckled. Signs were put up against her. People tried to break her. That's why she had such a stoic way with her. She was a very dignified and stoic woman. Ketanji Brown Jackson has said that were it not for the time and circumstances, Constance Baker Motley would have been the first black woman on the Supreme Court. This is the judge that the clerk draws out of this little revolving box, you know, that's been in that court. This is the mother court of our country, the Southern District Court of Manhattan. 189 years, they've never had a woman judge. I'm not saying black woman judge. They've never had a woman judge. She is the first woman judge in the history of this court, our mother court. She was also the first black federal judge ever to be appointed in our country. So this is the woman who understands the power and the precedent of the 14th Amendment when used for racial justice. So who's given her a little lift at this point? RBG, of course. What else would come into this story? RBG. RBG from 1970 to 1976, as anyone knows who followed her history with the Women's Law Center, her objective was to make women as visible as race with the use of the 14th Amendment. When she started out, the justices on our Supreme Court laughed her out of the courtroom when she brought in women plaintiffs. All right, I think we all know RBG well enough to know that she outsmarted them. She brought in male plaintiffs, males, men who had been discriminated against, and the judges couldn't ignore that. They weren't laughing anymore. And so by 1976, it's really quite amazing sometimes how precedent is changed. There's a case that comes out of against David Boren, who just died, who's the president of the university. And at this university was Oklahoma, right? That's where he was, right? Am I right? Yeah. Okay, so there's a case in which 21-year-old men are not allowed to buy near beer, but 18-year-old women are. This case gets to the Supreme Court. It's called Boren whatever. This is the case.
Against Boren.
Against Boren, yeah, because he's representing the university. This is the case in which the Supreme Court raises the level of judicial scrutiny for gender in our country. But it's after 6 years of a concentrated campaign. I think they just said, we're done. Okay, this is it. You get your intermediate scrutiny. So here we are, 76. In my case, arrives in 77. So this is the history that's happening at this time around this issue. So where was I going with that? Anyway, Constance Baker Motley knew this law better than probably any judge in the country. She knew the law. Did that mean that she was an automatic, yeah, you win it, okay, we don't even need to hear the arguments? No. You look at Tomiko Brown-Nagin's book, which is the definitive biography. I see Amelia shaking her head there, all right. Yes, she wrote the definitive biography called Civil Rights Queen. And in it, she did, preparing for it, she's a constitutional law expert at Harvard. She did some analysis, and she did a number of law review articles, and I've read them all. And in it, she looked at Constance Baker Motley's record through her entire career on the Southern District. Just so you frame it right here, it's not a slam dunk for us. In 14th Amendment cases, she ruled more often for the defendant than she did for the plaintiff. And I was the plaintiff. Okay? So we move into often assumptions about people based on, her work as a lawyer. But her judgment as a judge tells us a different story.
And Fritz had a lot of work to do in terms of she and he were both very well situated to kind of cut through the national narrative at the time. She didn't necessarily want to take this case that had something to do with baseball, which she only liked because her husband.
She didn't like
she
it.
Didn't
she
like
hated
it, but
it.
she had to listen to it because she had a husband who was a huge Yankees fan, as so often is the case. But she was also kind of prudish, as you wrote in your book.
Her son told me this. I mean, that, and Fritz actually learned this because, when you're going to be smart and you're an attorney, I see some attorneys sitting right in front of me, you're going to go out and you are going to find out as much about the law as you are about the person who's going to render that judgment. So he's talking to lawyers in his firm who have gone before her before, but he's also talking to her friends to find out about her. And he finds out that she's very prudish. And so he knows that if baseball sort of goes down this route of talking about nakedness the whole time,
Which is what everyone was talking
right,
about.
exactly, because they'd won in the court of opinion with talking about me as a lonely girl who was suing so I could go in and finally see a naked man. You know, that was kind of the narrative. And they pursued that. They pursued that, yes, they pursued that same narrative through their legal argument, and it wasn't a winning one with her. She didn't like to hear about this, and she basically says to them at one point, she says, you know, Attorney Klemenko, what if I were to tell you that I don't think nakedness is involved in this case? He was stunned. He was stunned into silence. I mean, he couldn't believe that she could see it this way. You know, and she kept pressing him to go back to the law, back to the law, go back to the law. And he just wanted to stay with the sexual privacy and the nakedness, best interests of baseball, etc. So yeah.
Which is kind of how this case was being told in culture at the time. I mean,
Yeah,
nowadays
absolutely.
it would be unfolding online and in social media, but can you tell us a little bit about how it was, what the narrative was, and how it was playing out and where it was playing out? Because it was in some of your own colleagues' newspapers as well.
Well, it's kind of interesting you ask, because I always bring this with me just in case. So here is Red Smith. He was considered the dean of sports writing. He had a column in the New York Times, and he also was syndicated. For anyone who's young, who doesn't know the word syndicated, just think about it as digital. Okay? It was sent out along a wire to newspapers all around the country and in Canada, etc. So what Red Smith wrote got a lot of attention, and it also shaped the narrative that other sports writers thought they could write. So, I'm going to add just something here before I read to you a little from Red Smith's piece about me. Because people say, what difference does it make if as a woman is doing sports? Well, it just so happened that in the one time in the entire history of the New York Times, they had a woman sports editor, Leanne Schreiber.
Wow.
Leanne did not catch his column in time for it not to go out on the syndicated wire. She did catch it in time to rectify the situation as she saw it in the New York Times. So we'll look at the difference that it made. So here's a headline from the syndicated one: locker room talk suit adds needed humor. And here's the one that she put on it in the New York Times: another view of equality. So there's a slight difference. And Leanne, even though she'd gotten sort of the implicit memo that as the editor, you never change a word of what Red Smith writes. You do it at your peril. And that was the way the men treated him. Leanne could have given a damn about that. She read his column and she did not like some of the things he wrote. And so she edited it, put on a different headline. So I'm going to read you the last paragraph, or the first and last paragraph from the one that went out as the syndicated, and then I'm going to share the last paragraph of hers. So he said, what with the many scandals in horse racing, boxing, and televised tennis, with violence on the field, in the rink, and the court, quarrels in the clubhouse, and rioting among spectators, laughs were not easy to come by in 1977. But just at the end, Melissa Ludtke struck a saving note of low comedy by contending in court that she could not cover the World Series for Sports Illustrated unless she could watch Reggie Jackson undress. That's the beginning, and now we have the last paragraph, okay? This is perhaps my favorite. She is speaking now about the ball players. If they enjoy exhibiting their manliness to some bit of fluff, that being me, that fluff.
Thank you, we got that.
Yeah, sorry. They'll seldom lack for opportunities. But they should not be required to do so, and they shouldn't have to wait around with their pants on until the last damsel quits the premises. So that was sort of setting the scene for what would follow, because the other sports writers took their lead from him. Fred Smith wrote this. This is our story. So this is the last paragraph that Leanne had on it. And it says, had she been thus occupied, she would have missed the gathering in another room down the hall where managers of both teams and key players on both sides were present to answer all her questions. So anyway, fluff is removed and other things, etc. So does it matter that women are in these positions? It does indeed. It does indeed. So that was kind of the way that it took off, and that was the narrative that sort of basically told my story. So when it came time 50 years later, or nearly 50 years later, that I had a chance to tell my story, I decided I liked Leanne's headline better, that it was about an equal rights case. It wasn't about the way the men characterized it as a woman who wanted to see men naked. So that's why I wrote the book the way I did about the case, and putting it in the context of the previous fights for racial justice and gender justice, etc., and really take you through the arguments that Fritz made to win this case. It wasn't an easy one for him to win.
So we only have a few minutes
Okay,
left.
let's do some
I want to see if you
questions.
want to take a couple
Want to do
questions.
some?
Yeah.
You all right?
Who has
Okay,
questions?
anyone have a question? In the back. Hi, oh my God.
So I want to just find out what happened, and it might be in the book, sorry. What happened in Red's narrative after you did get access? What was the change?
Oh, you mean what would Red have written afterwards? I think he was bored by the story by then. He didn't want to give it any play. He didn't really write about it much afterwards. I don't even have a column that he wrote about it. I think he was much more interested in sort of the theatrics of it and the sort of put-down phase than he was in recognizing the order and the fact that this was a legal case, in which a decision was rendered that moved against the decision that he wanted and the one that public opinion was calling for. So I think he lost interest. That didn't mean that everyone lost interest. Patrick Buchanan, who remembers Patrick Buchanan, one of our favorite conservative columnists, of course, he was active, and he was also syndicated in those days. So what he wrote went to many, many papers. And after my decision, he basically thanked Judge Motley, because he said with her decision, she had just about made sure that Phyllis Schlafly was going to win her argument against the ERA. Because if you remember, the ERA argument that Phyllis Schlafly was making was the fear that if we had equality, God help us, we'd be using the same bathrooms. So equate bathrooms with locker rooms. And Patrick Buchanan thought, okay, this is done. I mean, when these judges are making these kind of decisions, people will speak. And so he equated it with the surety that the ERA would be defeated. Turned out to be right. He turned out to be right.
Did you ever get a chance to talk to Judge Motley?
Never. I didn't ever meet Bowie Kuhn. I never had a chance to meet Judge Motley either. I've met her son, Joel Motley, who's fabulous. And Joel has made a short documentary about her that's, I think, online, which is really wonderful. It's about a 25-minute documentary about his mom. And no, I wish I had, but I've read every book that's now been written about her. There have been 3. She wrote one, an autobiography, and then a man named Gary Ford in Connecticut, which was her home state, wrote a book about her. And then the book Tomiko Brown-Nagin wrote about her is just fabulous. You've read it? Yeah, it's fabulous. Civil rights queen.
So I will just say, so Melissa and I obviously know each other.
Yes.
But Melissa's case.
Well, tell them just briefly who the book
So
you wrote.
my name's Alelia Bundles, and I'm a biographer. I write about my great-great-grandmother, Madam C.J. Walker, and I've just written a new book about her daughter that's coming out in June.
They're fabulous.
But
so,
like
yeah.
Melissa and I are contemporaries, and I was one of the first women producers at NBC News, and it was really a result of these lawsuits that women who had been secretaries and researchers, who stayed secretaries and researchers, while the guys were hired as desk assistants and they became senior
Yes,
producers and executive
exactly.
producers. So it's a similar
Yeah.
kind of thing. But because we did benefit from those lawsuits and those doors that were being opened 50 and 55 years ago, it just feels like those doors are being closed now. And I really am concerned for young women who don't have any idea of what is happening, what has happened, and what is happening now, where it's now okay to be sexually harassed. That we didn't have those definitions, but some of those doors are being closed.
Well, I have a 28-year-old daughter now, so I very much relate to this, and I rewrote the entire prologue of my book after the Dobbs decision to reflect the sort of currency of this case with what's happening now, particularly with the power that is in the 14th Amendment and that we're going to have to rely on more and more and more. I also made a very, very difficult for me and challenging decision after the Dobbs decision to bring into the narrative of my case, of my book, the fact that during the time that this case was coming before the public, I actually went through and had an abortion because I found myself pregnant at that time. And if that had ever come out, during that time, I just can't even imagine what would have been said about me, written about me, what it would have done to the case. I want to make clear that I did not have the abortion because of that fear. I had it because of my own personal choice about whether I was ready to become a mother at that point, and I've never looked back on that decision. But I didn't have it in the first 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 versions of this. But after Dobbs, I said I can't not write it. It was always in my mind. It was always the thought of getting it in, but I never kind of found the place and the way. But then I ripped up a few chapters and threw it in, and I then wrote, didn't just throw it in, but I wrote it in. And then I changed the prologue to speak to my daughter, about the 14th Amendment and about Dobbs and about that changing environment that she's growing up in today, which is so different than the hope that we had when we were able to use the courts of law. And I don't say use them in the sense of abusing them, but going to the courts of law to remove the barriers that were the legal barriers that should never have been there. And the law in the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment reminded us and told us that it was our constitutional rights not to have to deal with those barriers. And there's the wonderment about whether they're going to have that same capacity within the courts to have those arguments and those barriers that are being reintroduced taken away. So I'm very cognizant of it. One of the things that I love about this book, I better not be too attached to the idea that I'm ever going to make money on the book. So I have to find my pleasure somewhere else. And here's where I find it. I find it because this is now an entry for me to talk to young people. I go into more classrooms, a lot of them by Zoom, but I'm moderating 2 seminars for a UMass Lowell in a little while on women in sports and women in sports media. I'm asked to do things that I would never be able to do without a book, and this book, and that is the best part of what I do. I mean, I love being with all of you, but when I can go into classrooms with young people, I was just out at Indiana University doing this. That's where I want to be. I want to tell this story, not as just history, but connecting it to our story today. So, Kathleen.
I'm going to make first of all,
correction.
I'm going to say something that is probably not going to be beloved by this group.
What?
First of all, I love your book, Melissa.
Thank you, Kathleen.
I read it, and I think it's one of the coolest books I've read. So.
Oh, thank you, sweetie. Mwah. Thank you.
So that's number one. But this is one of the challenges about talking about this book, and one of the challenges that I'm just going to make us talk, because it's one of the challenges that we face as this audience is mostly women. And we're cheering Melissa because she was the first woman and really fought and did well. But politically, we have a problem in our party with men.
We do. You mean the Democratic Party?
Democratic Party with men. And so I think it's really important to think about how and you did this a bit, talking about the people who helped you, who were men. Your lawyer, the
Players.
the players, the Italians.
Yes.
Because it's really important, I think, that we at this point, as women, as we fight for women, that we also talk about that we love men and that we need to help everybody do well.
Yeah.
The male suicide rate has risen enormously. The boy suicide rate has risen enormously, way higher than it is for women. Males are going to college at a much lower 40% versus women going to college at 60%. So there is a real crisis. As been pointed out, dots for women, but there's also a real crisis for boys and men. So I think it's really important that we allow ourselves to talk both about there's a crisis for boys and men and for women and girls, and that we use both those, the language, because we need to win back all sexes.
Yes, there we are. Okay, thanks, Kathleen. Kathleen and I go way back, and that's a wonderful thank you contribution. I appreciate it.
I think this will be our last question.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, so I was at journalism school at UC Berkeley in the early 60s, so this is way before women. And I actually ended up getting my first job in Latin America because that was my, and I was the first woman they'd ever hired at AP there, and the reason I knew it is because it took them 5 days after they hired me to find a toilet seat. They'd never had a toilet seat on the so I was the first woman, you know. And there was only a couple of us allowed in the journalism school at the time. This was an undergraduate major. Now we've gone from, I understand, 90 to 95% of journalism students are women. And that has just been confirmed to me by maybe I'm wrong, but everyone I talk to, men aren't going into this field and they don't make enough money, because of course every time women get into something the money goes down, it seems. But I think that's a concern, and you know, I totally agree with her.
With Kathleen.
We could go the other way too.
Yes, with Kathleen,
And you know, especially these days where people are really sensitive about this stuff.
Yeah. Well,
So
you know,
how are you gonna do this?
how am I going to do it? I don't know that I'm going to do it, but I will make an observation about it, and that is that, you know, right now I think we all have to be about building bridges across a lot of different divides. And I think Kathleen has identified a very important divide. But I think we also have to make bridges across class divides, across age divides. There's a lot of bridge building. I was talking to my great friend Mary Jane just as we were driving up here, and we were talking about sort of what does activism look like, and I said, you know, I really don't like making these calls where I'm like yelling at people and screaming. It just doesn't feel good. I don't like it. I'm not happy with myself after I've made it. So I said, what I'm now look for is, because I follow the news, I'm a journalist, I like to follow the news. I'm not turning away from what's happening. And so I look at it, and when I see someone, even if I don't disagree with them on anything else, but if they've done something that I view as courageous for them and right to do, I'm going to call them and say thank you, instead of calling a congressional office and screaming at the staffer who answers the phone. I'll just give you a quick example. You know, when we got into this Putin area very deeply, there were 2 very major Republican senators who stood up that day and said very forthrightly what I feel, you know, that this is we should not be cozying up, you know, et cetera, et cetera. We need to go into that. But the 2 of them were Roger Wicker from Mississippi and John Kennedy from Louisiana. So I called their offices and said, thank you. And said, thank you for being bold and courageous and standing up against what is very much a powerful force against you and your party. Thank you. And so, you know, that's what I'm trying to do, is this bridge. You know,
Did you say you were a Democrat?
No, I said that I wasn't from Louisiana or Mississippi, but that they could tell it was a Democrat, I think, in what I said. I don't know, because of the way I said it, the voice, I don't know, but maybe next time I should add that. Maybe next time I should add that, but I didn't. Mary Jane, just let Mary, because I had this.
Come across. This book is many, many, many years in the making.
Yes.
This woman has been indomitable, very brave, very strong, struggling on her own
Yes.
to finally get this done, despite setbacks and pain. And it's, you know, it's magnificent, and you can talk about the book, and it's historic, and it's funny, and it's brilliant, but what went into it is not obvious in those pages.
Thanks, Mary. All right, so I guess we're done, or what?
Yeah, so,
I want to first of all thank Ava so much. I know I talk a lot. It's like you wind me up and I kind of talk. So, you know, I mean, yeah. But Ava has been fantastic. I just adore her writing. I love her, and I've just, you know, listened to her speak at the University of Maryland and said, I want her beside me. And the fact that she actually said yes was sort of like a marriage proposal. You know? I was so excited that she said yes. So thank you so much, and I encourage all of the Washingtonians to read her and her coverage. So thank you.